Welcome to our panel discussion today on how privacy reforms can protect Americans from political violence. My name is Luke Wachob. I am the Senior Director of Communications and Policy at People United for Privacy Foundation, and I will be moderating our discussion here today. We have a jam-packed 60-minute program for you today, and we promise to get you out on time. So we may not have time for audience questions, but that said, you are welcome to submit them through Zoom, and we will get to them if we do have a little bit of time at the end of our discussion here today. But to set the stage, why are we here? Well, for one, it is Free Speech Week, and that is always a good time for us to reflect on how donor privacy is important to free speech. However, much more seriously, we have also seen this year a very disturbing trend of political violence in the United States. We are now just about, I think, 6 weeks removed from the assassination of Charlie Kirk on a college campus in Utah as he was speaking. We also had that same month a shooting at an ICE facility in Dallas. Just a couple months before that, Minnesota House Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband were killed at their homes. And here in DC, a man was arrested with a Molotov cocktail and I believe a tent full of explosives just outside St. Matthew's Cathedral, where the Supreme Court justices were gathering. And that was right here in October. Those examples just begin to scratch the surface of the very concerning rise in political violence we've seen this year. They also all come from just the last handful of months. And this crisis of political violence intersects with People United for Privacy's mission in a really key way. Our interest in protecting every American's right to support causes they believe in privately is driven by this concern about protecting Americans from retaliation when they participate in public life. PUFPF was founded in 2018, and we had seen by that point already how political actors can use disclosure laws and disclosure demands to scare peaceful people away from donating to controversial causes. We used to see a lot of things like doxing, the cancel culture craze, efforts to get people fired from their jobs, boycotting of businesses. And violence always loomed in the background as the worst case scenario, something that occasionally happened, but was thankfully very rare. But that threat of actual real world violence has seemingly grown tremendously in recent years. And so we think now is the time to bring this discussion and this issue to a wider audience and try to get people thinking about it before the worst happens. So today I am very excited to welcome experts from a variety of organizations to talk about this rise in political violence and how privacy protections can help protect Americans and protect free speech. Each of the organizations you'll hear from today does really important work to shield civic engagement through privacy protections, and I'm excited to speak with them about that. To introduce our panel, we have Scott Blackburn from Americans for Prosperity. He is the legal portfolio manager at AFP. In that role, he helps them develop their litigation strategy and provides expertise on a number of policy issues, including judicial selection and donor privacy. He previously worked on campaign finance laws and other laws impacting political speech and brings over a decade of experience working in the policy world and in First Amendment spaces to our discussion here today. Thank you, Scott, for being here with us.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks for having me.
We are also joined by Dr. Helen Knowles-Gardner. She is the research director at the Institute for Free Speech, where she directs the Institute's research. She is the co-author of several books about the First Amendment and free speech, and she's also authored numerous peer-reviewed and law review articles, including some research about the seminal case for nonprofit donor privacy, which I'm very excited to ask her about in a little bit. Helen earned her PhD in political science from Boston University and a BA in American Studies. Thank you for being here, Dr. Knowles-Gardner.
Thank you very much, Luke. It's a pleasure to join you all this afternoon.
And lastly is my colleague, Matt Nese. He's the vice president here at People United for Privacy Foundation. Matt manages all of our legislative work, both federally and in the 50 states. And he has over a decade of experience in coalition building, legislative analysis, and strategy, which together has earned him a reputation as one of the nation's leading experts on legislative activity pertaining to free speech and donor privacy. Matt, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Luke, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Should be a good discussion on a very serious but very important topic.
Thanks, Matt. And that is enough of me talking for a little bit, so I will turn it over to our panel. I want to get started with you, Matt. This week, People United for Privacy Foundation announced a new model policy that we are calling the Protect Donors at Home Act. And this is specifically geared towards this problem of political violence. Can you tell me about that policy? What does it do, and how did it come about?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yes, we announced this policy, People United for Privacy Foundation did earlier this week, so everyone on today's webinar is among the first to hear about it. It's very important. You listed, Luke, and I don't need to resurrect everything you just said, but you listed a variety of political violence that has happened in states across the country affecting Republicans and Democrats in Minnesota, Utah, Texas. This bill, or I should say model policy, looks to protect small donors, political donors, and in some states with nonprofit donor disclosure laws, nonprofit donors too, that are vulnerable to political violence from extremists that would target Americans at their homes. In many states, unfortunately, giving $1 to a candidate can get your name and home address among your employer and other sensitive information included in a publicly available database. In some states that have thresholds above $0, the limit is usually 50, 20, 100. I think the maximum that any state has is New Jersey at $300. So we're talking generally about small donors to political activity that have their street addresses and employers listed online and are vulnerable in today's hyperpolarized, violent political climate to attacks from those who disagree with their views. The Protect Donors at Home Act is very simple. In light of that, it prohibits donors' street names, numbers, and their employers from being listed in campaign finance databases. The agencies themselves can collect this information, but they need to redact the street address and employer information from those donors so that they're safe from political violence at their homes and in their communities. It also prohibits this information from being accessed via public records and ensures agencies who violate this law are held liable, and that those who have their information illegally disclosed can challenge and seek relief in the courts. Why are we doing this? It's pretty simple. Modern technology has changed the calculus. Many nonprofit donor disclosure laws and political disclosure laws were introduced in the 1970s or thereabouts, way before the internet. You had to go to government buildings to access this information on tiny files. That's not the case today, where you can access sensitive information and everyone who's ever given to a candidate dating back for decades on with a few simple clicks of the internet and a simple Google search. Obviously, there's the increase in political violence, but interestingly and unsurprisingly, in the wake of the Minnesota murders of those lawmakers around the country rushed to protect their home addresses. We at People United for Privacy Foundation think that makes a lot of sense. They're wise to do so in this climate, but we're also asking that they protect their constituents and their supporters as well. No one who gives $10 or $20 to a candidate should have their name and home address plastered on the website for state campaign finance agencies. Many Americans aren't even aware these laws exist. They give a few dollars to those they support, and they have no idea that their home address and their employer are going to be publicly available and posted in a government database. And importantly, this is a bipartisan policy with precedent. Both California and Texas have exactly this policy on the books and have had so for some time. This is not a recent phenomenon. They've done this for over a decade, I believe. How often do California and Texas agree on a policy? Wyoming as well doesn't even require this information to be submitted to the state. So we think this is going to be an important policy, and we're urging state lawmakers around the country to support it.
Thanks, Matt. I want to ask you a quick follow-up there. You mentioned the thresholds for disclosure in the states, some of which don't even exist, and others are appallingly low. And you mentioned how many of the laws are outdated, and that Americans often aren't aware of the way their privacy is going to be violated when they make a contribution. Are those low thresholds something that lawmakers are even aware of? Are they adjusted for inflation? Do they review them? Or is that something that, like the other aspects of these laws, they didn't anticipate the internet? Was this a monetary threshold that got put in a long time ago and then just never got updated. And I know, of course, 50 different states means it's not all the same answer, but if you could sort of speak a little bit about your experience with these laws, kind of how did that come about that they're at such low levels? And is that something lawmakers even defend, or are they just not aware of it?
I think it's a little bit of both, but certainly a lot of these laws, as I mentioned, date back decades. In many cases, these thresholds have never been adjusted. Even when they have, it's been rare and it's not been adjusted significantly. As again, I can't emphasize enough that many of these laws, if not all of them, pretty much predate the internet, and the framework under which they operate predates the internet. So the thinking is largely stuck in that era, and that's what we're trying to account for with the Protect Donors at Home Act. I'm not aware of any state that indexes their disclosure thresholds to inflation. If there is, it's probably one or two states at best, especially given that many states don't even have a threshold for disclosure. As I mentioned, you give anything and your address and employer in many cases is out there. State lawmakers, I think, when they're aware of this, clearly in California and Texas and Wyoming, do understand the concern. They understand that if they're protecting and worried about their own homes, as they should be, then they should also potentially worry about their constituents' homes as well. And I think we're going to see an understanding on that front. I'd also note that this is not just a state issue. The federal threshold is $200, which I would argue is very low. It's been that way for decades as well. And the Bipartisan Federal Election Commission unanimously recommended in December of last year, urging Congress to amend the law so that the street addresses of donors' names are redacted from public view in the FEC's database that listing campaign donations. I'd also note, because I'm not sure if I mentioned it previously, the Protect Donors at Home Act still allows for an individual's name, their city, state, zip code, and occupation to be publicly disclosed. We're just saying, while that transparency is important, you don't also need to list a home address and the employer of someone who's given $15 to their local candidate.
It's an important clarification. Thanks, Matt. It's very interesting what you're saying about with campaign finance laws, and we happen to have one of the organizations that's been one of the longest time critics of the First Amendment restrictions in campaign finance laws, the Institute for Free Speech. Dr. Knowles-Gardner, I'd like to tag you in here and just sort of ask, as a threshold question, why does donor privacy matter for free speech? And how do these campaign finance disclosures threaten free speech?
Thank you, Luke. So I think one way to think about this question is to ask ourselves, what is the greatest value that the First Amendment exists to protect? And I think we'd all agree here that the greatest value is in protecting unpopular speech. If you're saying something that's popular, that's not what really needs to be protected. And obviously, if you're saying something unpopular, it carries that much more of a greater risk. There's the risk of going against the cultural grain, the risk of offending the sensibilities of the majority out there who just don't agree with what you're saying. And this can be the sensibilities of the majority at any given moment in history. And that creates such an environment wherein if you fail to protect the right of people to speak anonymously, it's tantamount to failing to protect the speech of everybody. And so when you think about it, when the identity of someone who supports, like, quote unquote, a kind of disfavored view, whether it's a view that the majority of people don't like, or just the view that the government doesn't like, when that identity of someone expressing these disfavored views becomes known, the information can be so easily weaponized, particularly, as Matt was saying, in this hyper-polarized environment where people see something on social media about a disfavored view and they immediately react to it in a kind of a knee-jerk reaction way, which all too easily, very sadly and tragically, can lead to the examples of political violence that we've been talking about. This not only suppresses the speech of the speaker, but it chills the speech of everybody. It chills the speech of others who may agree, but who will think twice about supporting the cause of the trouble because of the trouble it brings.
It's a very interesting explanation, and it reminds me of something that you often hear, or that I used to hear a lot from advocates of more disclosure. They would always sort of say, sunlight is the best disinfectant. They're not the only people who use that phrase, but they would employ it in that argument. And that I always sort of thought about how that just assumes not even the wisdom of the crowd, but sort of the morality of the crowd, that exposed to the light of day, that will lead everyone to behave and act in a more virtuous manner, where that may not be the case. And of course, with disclosure laws, even if you don't offend the majority, it only takes one person, as we've seen with a lot of this political violence. You know, there's a lot of, lone wolves out there, and it only takes one. So I think a lot of the logic of disclosure is sort of challenged in an environment where we see rising political violence. Um, and this is not just a concern for campaigns and campaign donors. This is also a concern for nonprofits, which is where People United for Privacy Foundation does the vast majority of its work. And Scott, I know your organization was the plaintiff in the lawsuit against a California dragnet of nonprofit donor and member information. And that legal fight went up to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2021. It was a big victory for you all and for the First Amendment. Can you tell us about that case and about the concerns your organization had when California was demanding your donor list?
Sure. It all started about a decade ago when a little-known California Attorney General named Kamala Harris thought she had found an avenue for deterring disfavored speech in California. That was to require all nonprofits in the state, all charities, anyone with a IRS nonprofit designation, to give over their donors to California. And California would decide if they'd committed a crime in any of the many ways that you can commit a crime in the state. And that their entire justification was essentially that they wanted and they could find some illegal political illegal activity sometime down the road, and we need those donors to investigate. AFPF fought that. We had an extensive trial where we demonstrated some of the problems that you see with disclosure laws. We demonstrated harassment to our organization. We demonstrated death threats to some of our donors that had been exposed accidentally. We demonstrated that California was unable to keep these records private themselves. They had put them up on their website, and anyone was able to access them as soon as California put them up there. So after an extensive legal fight getting to 2021, the Supreme Court heard the case and said, essentially, yes, this is a First Amendment threat. We have a right to private association in this country, and if the government can't demonstrate a compelling reason why they need access to your donor information, it is against the Constitution for the government to come and try to take that information. And California didn't, in this case, demonstrate a compelling reason to do so. And we were able to protect our donors and also nonprofits in generally from the chill that would occur if any government, not just California, but it would apply equally to Texas or Alabama or Maine or Vermont, was able to simply request all donors at any time from any organization.
That's really fascinating, this sort of lack of any specific basis, and just the sort of the Attorney General's curiosity being the reason for the disclosure. Is that really the case? They weren't able to sort of demonstrate here are times that we used this information and it was essential, and we couldn't have ferreted out this fraud or whatever illegal activity was going on without these donor lists?
Throughout the, again, extensive record in the case, they could not point to a single instance where they could not have obtained information they needed using regular law enforcement tools like subpoenas. They couldn't point to a single instance where they used donor information when they did collect it. They simply wanted it, and it's pretty clear that Kamala Harris wanted it because she thought she could use this information to chill advocacy she didn't like. In that case, conservative advocacy that might oppose some of her policies in the state.
I'm sure that wasn't what it was about, Scott. You must be misinterpreting the former vice president's motives there. But I think that speaks to the concerns that the groups have. If you're criticizing a powerful politician or their agenda or the movements they're associated with, you very well might not want them to have a list of everybody who is a member or a donor to your organization, and that would apply with progressive groups in a red state just as well as it would with conservative groups in blue states, and we do see that throughout the nation. Now, Scott, I know that victory. I'll turn to Helen here. It was built on a mountain of precedent, establishing the importance of donor privacy rights to the First Amendment, a body of law that sometimes we see politicians or even some lower courts seem to ignore because they want to allow disclosure demands to move forward. But some of the precedent is pretty strong, including a unanimous 1958 case called NAACP v. Alabama, in the heart of the civil rights movement. And Dr. Knowles-Gardner, you've done some deep archival research on this case. Can you tell us about what happened in the case, and how did donor privacy become a central issue in the civil rights movement?
I really like the fact that I'm going after Scott with this question, because you can basically draw a straight historical Supreme Court presidential line from NAACP versus Alabama to the AFPF case. I'm going to start with, to kind of distill and explain this case, I'm going to start with some numbers. 8 years, 3 months, and 10 days. For 8 years, 3 months, and 10 days at the height of the civil rights movement, the NAACP didn't exist in Alabama, simply did not exist, did not have any kind of offices on the ground in Alabama. Why? Because Alabama had put in place legal obstacles and then legal procedural obstacle after legal procedural obstacle, making it impossible legally for the NAACP to exist and to operate in that state. This was a crucial time for the civil rights movement. At stake was the ability of Black Alabamians to secure basic civil liberties and civil rights, for which the NAACP played an important, basically a crucial organizational role, especially in the immediate aftermath of the decision in Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. Black Alabamians needed that organizational structure to help them to advance their civil rights and civil liberties. This was taken away from them by an extremely zealous state attorney general, John Patterson, and complicit state and local judges in Alabama. What Alabama did was to undertake a very cold and calculated effort to crush the voice and the organizational efforts of basically what amounted to about, at the time, a third of the population of the state. That effort began on June 1st, 1956, when John Patterson walks into a Montgomery circuit court, a state circuit court courthouse, and requests an injunction, which he knows is going to be granted. He goes to a very sympathetic state judge. He absolutely knows that this is going to be granted, an injunction preventing the NAACP from doing business in Alabama. The NAACP was a corporation chartered in New York State. As such, it was what was known as a foreign corporation doing business in Alabama. And basically, the state used a law that had been on the books for a very long time. The NAACP had been doing business in Alabama for several decades. All of a sudden, post Brown versus the Board of Education, the state comes along and uses this law to basically say to the NAACP, sorry, we're going to oust you from the state because you're not complying with our foreign corporation registration law. Subsequent court rulings, which came very quickly, then said to the NAACP, rather disingenuously, but that's a digression, said to the NAACP, you can return to the state to do business in the state on several conditions, the most important of which for our discussion here is we require you, the NAACP, to turn over to us, the state, copies of all of your membership lists, which show the names and addresses of all of your members. Just think about that for a minute. Two things associated with that. First of all, everybody knew why the state was doing this. This was no secret. Everybody knew the motives of the state. Secondly, everybody knew what would happen if these tens of thousands of names and addresses were turned over to the state and then obviously would become well known to private organizations, which would then just lead to a spiral of terrorizing tactics against these individuals whose names and addresses had been disclosed. Where does the Supreme Court fit into this? Well, not once, not twice, not even 3 times, but 4 times between June 30th, 1958 and June 1st, 1964. In that period of 6 years, the nation's highest court rules 4 times in favor of the NAACP, 4 times unanimously. But it wasn't until September 11th, 1964, that Alabama finally gives up and says, okay, we're not going to require the disclosure of this information. And that was when the NAACP was allowed to return to Alabama. In terms of freedom of association jurisprudence and drawing a direct line to the case that Scott was talking about, the most important ruling was the one on June 30th, 1958, NAACP versus Alabama ex rel Patterson. That's where the court says the state compelled disclosure of this information runs afoul of the First Amendment, hence the direct line connecting NAACP versus Alabama to AFPF versus Bonta.
Thank you for that fascinating history. And, you know, I have been guilty many times of treating that case as a singular case, and that the court set down this awesome ruling in 1958, and there we were. But it was a long fight to actually get that into action. And although times have changed tremendously, I think it does speak to something that remains true to this day, which is that you can't rely entirely on court precedents to protect these rights, and that you often need something in the law. And it's one of the reasons that we often advocate for proactive legislation, because we know the censors cling to these powers as tightly as they possibly can. And, you know, even when the court tells them very directly, you can't do this, we find them doing something very similar, you know, the next day, essentially. But I do want to ask you, Helen, about you know, the difference in time between then and now. When this case gets brought up today, there's a lot of times there's some pushback that, you know, it's an extreme period in our history. The threats that were faced by NAACP members and supporters in the Jim Crow South at that time. And maybe nonprofits and donors today, they don't face the same kinds of risks. Some they do, some they do not. Always kind of hard to judge that. It's one reason that it's better to protect up front until you wait and see what happens to determine how serious the threat was. But when we're thinking about this case in the modern context, what does it teach us? What should we take away from NAACP v. Alabama for today?
On one level, I kind of understand the pushback, because if you look at the court filings in the case back in 1957 and 1958, the NAACP itself placed a great deal of focus in its briefs on the context of the case. And if you look at the way the justices decided the case, there's a lot of reference to context there. One of the interesting things I uncovered was wonderful correspondence between Justice Tom Clark and Justice Felix Frankfurter. And sort of simply put, it was completely attributable to Justice Frankfurter talking Justice Clark out of writing a dissenting opinion in the Patterson case, and basically saying there's too much at stake here for the civil rights movement. There's too much at stake here post Brown versus the Board of Education for us to not release a unanimous opinion. So on one level, I get that people, when they look at this case and look at its legacy, focus on the civil rights movement legacy, focus on the decision at a particular moment in time. I get that. But there's a big however here. And it's however, look at what the court said in NAACP versus Alabama, ex rel. Patterson, and the three other decisions. The two main decisions, both written by Justice Helen. The two other opinions were per curiam decisions. Helen doesn't focus on the civil rights movement context of these decisions. He doesn't say we are making a decision in these cases that is confined to the civil rights movement, that is confined to the NAACP. And I'm just going to give you a quote from his opinion. He says, and I quote, "Inviolability of privacy in group association may in many circumstances be indispensable to preservation of freedom of association, particularly where a group espouses dissident beliefs," end quote. He doesn't say particularly with regards to the NAACP, where a group espouses dissident beliefs. In this, again, this hyper-polarized, hyper-partisan political violence climate, the number of groups who espouse dissident beliefs could be endless. One person could look at one group and say it espouses dissident beliefs. What Helen is saying here is a statement of constitutional principles. It's not a statement of constitutional principles applicable only to the NAACP or only in 1958. Dissident beliefs in this day and age could mean absolutely anything to anyone. And so I think that's why I would very seriously push back against these people who say that NAACP versus Alabama is situated with one group and in one time only.
Points well said, Helen. I think, yeah, we see that a lot of attempts to distinguish, but it's that for, in many circumstances, not a few extreme rare circumstances, but there are many circumstances where donor privacy rights are going to be essential. And yeah, I think for a long time, you talk about disclosure or donor privacy being essential to protecting controversial views. And we talk about that less and less because what even is a controversial view in today's political environment? More and more mainstream opinions can get people, canceled or doxxed. And, depending on who's in power, there can be pretty radical shifts on what is, the establishment view and what is the dissident view. So, now it seems like it's a lot harder to have any, faith that you're in the mainstream and that no one's going to take issue with it because, hey, I'm just giving to this, mainstream organization. It's hard to even name examples of groups that take any kind of stand on political issues that aren't controversial with somebody. So I take that point about looking at the language of the decision and not just the political context around it. I think that's very important. And we have another person on the panel who has seen a lot of years on this issue, and Matt, not to call you old, but I know you've been working on donor privacy in the states and federally for so long. What have you seen change over the years, either in the privacy concerns that exist for donors or in lawmakers' attitudes towards the issues? What have been the big changes over the course of your career?
Well, I suppose I'm starting to get old at this point now that I've been doing this for over 15 years. Yeah, it's been interesting. I would say it's a bit of a mixed bag. I'll start with the bad and then get to the good. Earlier in my career, dating back circa 2010 and a little earlier, from lawmakers, you would hear a lot of just not taking the threat to donor privacy, the threat to American safety seriously. Issues and concerns were waved off. I think that looks especially foolish and short-sighted in the current political environment, where people are threatened, where people are doxxed, where people are vitriolic towards one another they disagree with, just the language we're using, as well as the acts of political violence, unfortunately, that we have seen. I've also would note that today the legislative threats are getting far worse. Early in my career, it was, well, we just want, to know donors who earmark their donations to nonprofits, then engage in issue or political advocacy. And then that expanded to, well, we need to know your entire donor list. And then now we're faced with a situation coming out of Arizona, and we might talk about that later, where it's not enough for the nonprofit to disclose their donor list. They have to disclose the donors of organizations that donate to them going back infinitely with really no end in sight. And we're also seeing things applied to other forms of advocacy that aren't political at all, like donor disclosure for groups that file amicus briefs before federal courts, donor disclosure for groups that speak not to lawmakers but to the public about issues before the legislature, donor disclosure for groups who file comments and organize others to file comments on federal and state rulemakings. And so, in that sense, I've seen lawmakers early on, brush away these concerns. I've seen the threats grow in terms of prevalence and seriousness, but I've also seen, especially recently, a bipartisan awareness of the threat and the concern. We are seeing, I won't sugarcoat it, donor disclosure threats from what I would call thin-skinned politicians on both sides of the aisle who just want to target those they disagree with, speech they dislike, groups that are advocating for things they don't support. But we're also seeing, especially outside of the legislature, the nonprofit community writ large coming together when threats emerge or when proactive opportunities to strengthen donor privacy rights are out there, support for those causes and legislative efforts, as well as bipartisan interest from lawmakers in strengthening and protecting donor privacy rights once they realize what's at stake and once there is a proposal in front of them. People United for Privacy Foundation has other model legislation. One of them, the Personal Privacy Protection Act, governs, especially in the wake of AFPF v. Bonta, which Scott discussed, state agency action and ability or inability, rather, to collect and disclose nonprofit donor lists outside of very specific and certain circumstances. And we have seen 22 states now pass that law, protecting over 100 million Americans. We've also seen 3 states, very geographically and politically different, Alabama, Colorado, and Nebraska, pass those bills unanimously through their legislature. We've also seen, as I mentioned, the nonprofit community come together to support those bills. We've had support from groups like Scott's organization, Americans for Prosperity, and the American Civil Liberties Union. We've seen support from both Planned Parenthood and Right to Life groups. We've seen support from labor unions and business interests. And I think that is a sign of a growing awareness of the threat that exists. And even when individuals and organizations disagree, they realize that these laws don't just target one side, they negatively impact everyone, because there's no way to say, oh, you only donor disclosure for groups I like. No, it's donor disclosure for groups writ large. There's no really way to cabin that, nor should there be, because that's not principled and that would violate the First Amendment and likely be unconstitutional. But I think everyone is starting to realize what's at stake, which it's sad and tragic that our current environment is making that happen, but I do think it's a positive thing overall for the First Amendment and for robust public debate, for bipartisan understanding of what's at stake and the importance of these rights.
And those kinds of broad cross-partisan coalitions are a rarity these days. So I'm always very heartened to see when we get those groups on totally opposite sides coming together to call out a threat or to work together on an opportunity. I think that's, that's American politics working the way that it should. And it's always gratifying to see groups that are usually opposed able to find some common ground. And I think that is an interesting thing about this issue, which scrambles some of the partisan divisions that exist in our politics. It's really an issue defined by who holds power and who wants to challenge and criticize power. And so it can differ dramatically from state to state. And it's often the states that have some experience with both sides being in charge that sort of understand at the deepest level what is at stake here. And Matt, you mentioned Arizona, which is timely because I did want to ask Scott about that. There is a law in Arizona that passed via ballot measure a few years back that has this concept called original source disclosure. And we are seeing this more and more in proposals to invade the privacy of nonprofits and their donors. And your organization, Scott, Americans for Prosperity Foundation, is currently involved in litigation against that law. Tell me about that case.
Absolutely. So to contrast the sort of nonprofit donor privacy jurisprudence that we've seen from NAACP v. Alabama up to AFPF v. Bonta, there's a counter set of jurisprudence which says that in express political advocacy situations, donor disclosure is allowed. So when you give a donation directly to a candidate, that donation can be disclosed. And the Supreme Court has said that's okay because it is attached directly to the important government interest of preventing corruption or its appearance. Now, that is effectively being used as a loophole to capture more and more political speech, including things that go outside the express advocacy context and into more traditional nonprofit advocacy, which is what is happening with the true donor disclosure law in Arizona. To just give you an example of what could happen in Arizona, to maybe give you a picture of the extent of this. The idea is you trace the money back to an individual person, and that's the person who controlled the speech I don't like and has to be disclosed. So, for instance, if you tithe to your church, and then your church buys a booth at the local fair that is run by a charity organization, and then that charity organization goes to an event where they buy a table that is hosted by a social welfare group. And that social welfare group then goes to another event where they buy a fundraising package that is hosted by a business league. And then that business league gives to a different issue advocacy organization where what they do is they support certain issues on let's say gun rights. And then that gun rights issue advocacy organization sees that there's a ballot measure in Arizona that would restrict gun rights. So they donate to the ballot measure committee that is fighting that measure. If that chain of events were to happen in Arizona under Prop 211, the law that we're challenging, the tithe to the church of the individual may need to be disclosed. Not anyone who made the decision along the line. It doesn't matter if you know about the ballot measure. It doesn't matter if you gave the donation before the ballot measure existed. It doesn't matter if you have the opposite view on the ballot measure. Your donation is the one that's tied to the ballot measure. Now, we don't believe that is fighting corruption. If for no other reason, then there's no politician in that chain to be corrupted. But also because there's no way for the church tither to have respect for the underlying speech that's occurring. And since that's the case, we're challenging this law in federal court. There's another challenge from Free Enterprise Club being done by the Goldwater Institute in state court. And we're making the same kind of donor privacy arguments that were made in AFPF and were made in NAACP v. Alabama saying you must have show a direct nexus between the disclosure that is happening and the goal that you're trying to accomplish.
That example is stunning, and I think it speaks to one of the issues here. I've read a lot of the media coverage in Arizona, and when they even bother to note that this can get to non-campaign entities, they mostly just quote the terms that are in the law, which would make you think this is all standard campaign finance stuff. But they sort of frame the debate as like, whether or not we want to disclose the original donor. But oftentimes it's like, are we, we could chase all money back to the print, and that wouldn't tell us anything interesting about power in politics. And so I think that tension has not been explored enough with the Arizona law and with this original source disclosure concept of, are we just tracing the money, or are we actually trying to trace the influence and the power, and who actually made a decision to take the resources in their control and put them towards campaign activity? I think there's a good argument that is really the entity that is of, to whatever degree that there is a public interest in disclosing this stuff, that's the entity that people should know about, and not, where did every actual, dollar come from, its entire path back to when it was printed. And
100%. And just even if you disagree with us about the sort of privacy concerns with disclosure in these kind of contexts, people who advocate for more disclosure like this don't seem to understand the potential damage it does to their own cause. The church tither in my example is not the same as someone who gave $500,000 directly on speech toward the gun ballot measure, but they are listed in the campaign finance database in the same way. They're right next to each other, supporting the speech in the same manner. And that goes to misinform, not inform any voters.
That's well said. Matt, I know these original source bills are something that you've been watching this year. What are you seeing on that issue in the States? And are there any other trends that people on this call should be watching out for?
Sure. I don't like to acknowledge this, but the reality is, People United for Privacy produces a report every year at the beginning of the year looking at state legislative sessions. You can find that on our website. And one of the things we correctly predicted this year was that there would be an uptick in quote unquote true or quote unquote original source disclosure in the states, modeled after the invasive and frankly awful Arizona law that AFPF and others are challenging. We did see that. 7 states introduced these such bills this year. I'll just name them since it's not a long list. Colorado, Hawaii, Idaho, Maine, Minnesota, North Carolina, and North Dakota. I name those states for a reason. There's a lot of geographic and political diversity. They're not all blue states. They're not all red states. They're a mix in every way. I'm happy to report all such bills died, and I'm also happy to report there was a lot of bipartisan opposition to these bills in all of the states where they advanced. Some did move through the process, but ultimately died, and then a few of them will carry over automatically to the 2026 session. So we're seeing an uptick in this issue, but what's also concerning is we're not just seeing it legislatively, we're seeing an uptick on the ballot, which is perhaps unsurprising given that in Arizona, this became law through the ballot. Just this week, it was announced that there is a pending Show Michigan the Money initiative, that's their name, to require seemingly the same type of original source disclosure as the Arizona law facing litigation in state and federal court. There's no text available for this initiative yet. It's obviously, as I said, just was announced this week. The goal by the sponsors to get this on the November 2026 ballot, but we are seeing these efforts explode legislatively and of course at the ballot box in states where that is an option, and it's concerning. I will just note, in addition to the privacy concerns that Scott mentioned through his example, which I think is extremely both accurate and illustrative. It's not just privacy at stake here. It's the mere fact that when faced with this, nonprofits don't even want to engage. Same with individuals who are concerned with the law because there's no way to understand how to comply. It's caused chaos in Arizona, the only state with such a law at this point. Many groups have filed when they have the money to hire an expensive attorney. Obviously, many groups don't have that luxury. They filed rulemaking requests and other advisory opinion requests with the agency in Arizona tasked with enforcing the law, just trying to understand what is their even obligation to comply. And because that's so difficult, frankly, the commission in Arizona has in some cases not known the answer. You just have a lot of groups that aren't getting engaged. I think that's bad for our form of government, bad for debate in this country. And I think that was frankly the ultimate goal of those who backed this effort was not just donor privacy and doxing and shaming, though those things all, or donor disclosure, doxing and shaming, and those things certainly all were part of the goal, but it was to confuse and just motivate groups to stay out of the discussion entirely.
Thanks, Matt. We are starting to run short on time here. So before we get to a final question for each of the panelists, did want to, since we've mostly been talking about the states here, take a quick moment to turn federally to Congress. Anyone on the panel that wants to take this one, you're welcome. But in addition to everything at the state level we've been talking about, what should Congress or the administration be doing to address political violence and donor privacy on the federal level?
I'm happy to take it. And of course, if others want to jump in, they can. I'll be cognizant of the time. I mentioned this earlier when talking about our Protect Donors at Home Act. On the federal level, as I said, the Federal Election Commission unanimously recommended to Congress that they also redact donor street names and addresses from information in the FEC's database. So again, you would only access the name of a donor as well as their city, state, and zip code. You would not need to know precisely what street and house they live on that street. We absolutely encourage members of Congress to take that legislative recommendation seriously, and I'm optimistic that they will. There's a lot of concern, understandably, in Congress about members and staff and their families' security, and again, we urge them to protect their constituents and supporters as well. I also mentioned earlier that People United for Privacy Foundation has model legislation in the states. There's a federal government version that also governs how state agencies can interact with, federal agencies can interact with donor lists and nonprofit member lists. Congress has included that in a number of bills last session, and we encourage them to do so again. I would also just more broadly note that I think regardless of party, every member of Congress needs to take seriously and think through in our current environment what legislation they're proposing and how it would impact American donors to American nonprofits. I think there is a desire and for some members of both parties now to target groups they disagree with, and they are floating laws that I think would do much damage to Americans, their safety, and the nonprofit sector in our debate at large. And then I would also encourage, this goes for the current administration and future administrations, anything that is looked at or done to weaponize government power to target one's enemies should be obviously avoided. Not only, again, is that unprincipled and dangerous, it also sets a dangerous precedent, and you can be sure that eventually when power inevitably changes hands, at some point that power will be used against quote unquote your team. And I think that's something that everyone needs to keep in mind with these laws, regardless of one's self-interest. And again, I don't endorse any of it. Everything you do to target those you disagree with will inevitably be used by those you disagree with to target you and those you agree with. And that's a lesson in this area that can't be forgotten.
That's a great point to lead into our wrap up here. And I want to thank Dr. Knowles-Gardner and Scott Blackburn for being our guest experts here today. And I'll give them a chance to give a closing remark here or let us know, what do you think the future holds on this issue and for political violence? Should we be optimistic? Do we expect it to get worse? What's a closing thought you want to leave us with? Scott, I'll start with you.
I think it's important to be optimistic in a situation like this. I think that people are to some extent waking up to the threat of political violence that exists in a hyper-polarized world. But more importantly, I think they're waking up to the importance for in-between spaces where we can exist in that world without having to pick one team or the other. And that's one of the sort of secret advantages of privacy in general and privacy for nonprofit support. You don't have to get on your high horse and shout about the most important thing and have it rule your life when you give to a nonprofit or when you give to a charity or when you give to an advocacy organization. You can give because you care about it a little bit, and you don't have to, that cost shouldn't ruin your life. But if a lot of people care about something a little bit, it makes a big difference. And making that big difference, being able to combine your resources with other people's resources to associate freely and advocate for the things you care about, is how we regain some of the mainstream middle spaces that appear to be lost in our politics today.
Thank you, Scott. Always appreciate a note of optimism to end a serious discussion. Dr. Knowles-Gardner, the floor is yours.
I think I'm going to go back to something I said earlier, Justice Harlan's words in the Patterson decision in 1958, which are as relevant today as they were back then. He talked about the importance of preserving freedom of association, particularly when a group espouses dissident beliefs. If you think you know what a dissident belief is, if you think you know how to define a dissident belief, think again. Unfortunately, in this climate, and my closing remarks are going to be a little more negative than Scott, so I apologize about that. But if you think you know what a dissident belief is, think again, because it only takes one person to define a dissident belief as something they vehemently disagree with. And in this environment, that can spiral out of control very quickly. And I would caution anybody watching this, any lawmakers out there, to just really seriously consider what implications are attached to freedom of association and the importance of protecting donor privacy.
That's well taken. Yeah, I think this is an issue that doesn't seem important until it's critically important. And it feels like a luxury until it's not. So it's something we always want to get out ahead of, and particularly as conditions are getting worse. This political violence issue is something that needs to be addressed from a lot of different angles. We're not saying that donor privacy solves this problem, but it takes a lot of names off of the target list. It makes it a lot harder for people who want to do harm to get at the people that they want to get at. And like Scott was saying, a bunch of small actions put together can accomplish big change. And so I think that's why we are so committed to making sure that privacy reforms are part of this conversation. As Matt said, we've already seen elected officials embrace this in a lot of contexts. And we just want to widen that net and make sure everyone who's participating in public life has an expectation that not only can they enter the public square and exercise their First Amendment rights, but you can also exit the public square and go back home and go about your business without having your life totally upended by your civic participation because some person out there didn't like the group that you supported or the thing that you said. I think we are just about out of time, so we are going to wrap it up there. I want to thank Scott and Helen once again for participating. Thank all of our attendees for watching. You can follow our organizations at unitedforprivacy.com, ifs.org, and americansforprosperity.org. And we will leave it there. You can also find us on social media. Thanks for coming. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.